when the ground began to tremble beneath my boots, I understood that the earth itself was about to roar. I was 19 that summer of 1943, a boy wearing a man's uniform, and that year I learned that sometimes the silence before a battle can make a man shake more than the battle itself. My name is Mikhail Ivanov. I'm 99 years old now, and I live in a small wooden house near Kursk, surrounded by golden fields of wheat that still sway with the same wind that once carried the smoke of war. Every morning I rise early, warm a samovar filled with black tea, and sit on my porch listening to the birds that returned long after the war was gone. Their song is a gift, because there was a time when the only sound in the sky was the thunder of engines and the echo of explosions. Sometimes when I close my eyes, the song of the sparrows fades, and another sound takes its place. A darker one, the roar of tanks, hundreds of them, advancing across the plains like an ocean of steel. And in that moment I'm no longer the old man you see. I'm that 19-year-old again, standing knee-deep in mud, writing hurried letters in a trench that smelled of oil, fear, and sweat, wondering if I'd ever see the sunrise again. We thought we were ready, but nothing prepares you for the sound of 1,000 engines awakening at once, for the earth shaking as if giants were marching beneath it. The air itself vibrated, and even the birds fled, as if nature knew that death was about to walk among us. That morning the horizon turned black with smoke. The tanks came closer and the ground shook like thunder rolling under our feet. Someone beside me whispered a prayer. Another loaded his rifle with trembling hands. And I just stared at that endless line of metal beast, knowing that in a few seconds, the world would erupt. Now, so many decades later, I still wake at dawn and feel that vibration beneath my feet, not from the tanks, but from memory itself. That's why I tell you this story, my friend, because battles aren't just fought with weapons. They are fought in the heart, in the moments when you stand between life and death, and decide, somehow, to keep standing. And every morning when I hear the wind move through the wheat, I remember that the earth that once shook with the roar of war, now trembles softly with the breath of peace. That sound, that gentle sound, is the victory we never thought we'd live to hear. If I close my eyes, I can still go back to that summer. The summer of 1943. The sun was merciless that year. It fell over the Russian fields like fire. The earth was dry and cracked, dust clinging to our skin, to our tongues, to our fear. But what I remember most wasn't the heat. It was the silence. That heavy, suffocating silence that tells you something enormous is about to happen. We were young. God, we were just kids. Some had just left school, others still carried photos of sweethearts folded in their pockets. All of us wanted the same thing, to make it home. But home felt 1,000 worlds away. We were buried in muddy trenches, cleaning our rifles, checking helmets, pretending not to think. Nobody said it aloud, but we all knew. What was coming wasn't just another battle. It was the battle. The one that would decide everything. I remember staring at the horizon. The wheat fields swayed gently in the wind, golden, endless, as if the world itself refused to notice what was about to happen. But I knew. We all did. Soon those same fields would burn, and the soil would drink fire instead of rain. The air was so still that even the birds were gone. They had the sense to flee before the storm arrived. Some of the boys wrote letters, shaky hands, trembling hearts, promising to return, promising to survive. I wrote one too. I still remember the words, dirt-stained and clumsy. If I don't come back, remember me as a son and as a brother. At night, under skies so full of stars it hurt to look at them, we heard the rumors. Thousands of German tanks rolling forward. Thousands of Soviet guns waiting in the fields. A sea of steel about to collide. And us, small, frightened men caught between giants. You could smell the oil before you heard the engines. That thick, greasy scent that told you war was already breathing down your neck. Our gloves were slick with sweat. The helmets felt heavier with every hour. Each breath we took was 1 second closer to the unknown. And friend, I swear to you the earth was alive that morning. It pulsed beneath us, as if it knew it was about to be torn apart by the roar of machines. That roar, that thunder of metal and hatred, still echoes inside me when the nights grow quiet. That was the dawn of Kursk. A summer of steel, fire, and dust. The prelude to hell itself, where ordinary men like us became witnesses to the largest tank battle the world would ever see. I remember it with a knot in my throat, because that morning we were still human. We still had fear and hope, and crumpled letters in our pockets waiting to be read. And just hours later, my friend, that roar swallowed it all. They say the worst part of war isn't the battle, it's the waiting. And in Kursk we learned that with our very souls. The days before the fight felt endless. An eternity made of dust, sweat, and silence. We Soviets dug trenches like madmen hour after hour, our nails breaking in the dry earth, our palms full of blisters, mud sticking to our uniforms, sweat burning our eyes, and dust filling our mouths until it tasted like metal. Every shovel of dirt felt like we were digging our own graves. Sleep barely existed. Some prayed under their breath. Others just stared into the horizon, trying to guess the exact second when hell would finally arrive. I remember Ivan, my trench mate. He was just 18. Each night, he'd pull a small medal from his pocket, a gift from his mother, and press it against his chest. He never spoke much, but in his eyes lived the fear of the whole world. The air was thick with the smells every soldier knows too well. Motor oil, the sharp sting of gunpowder still sealed in crates, and the sour scent of men who'd been waiting too long to die. That mix of smells told us everything. The roar was coming even if we couldn't hear it yet. The officers moved between us, whispering orders, checking positions, pretending their voices didn't tremble. But we knew. We all knew. Somewhere beyond that horizon, a storm of steel and fire was already gathering speed. At night, the Russian sky blazed with stars, so bright, so cold, but none of us dared look up. Our eyes stayed fixed on the dark line of the horizon, waiting for that first flicker of engines, that first hum that would mean it had begun. Sometimes a dog barked far away, and every man jumped like a gun had gone off. The silence was cruel, so cruel it made the smallest sounds unbearable. The scrape of a rifle against wood, the spark of a match lighting a cigarette, the whisper of a prayer. Every noise felt too loud, because we knew it would soon be drowned out by the roar of thousands of tanks. One night I took a letter from my pocket. I didn't read it. I didn't need to. I just held it in my hand, crumpled, dirty, and reminded myself I had to survive, if only to deliver it myself someday. That letter wasn't just paper. It was hope. It was the one thing that still tethered me to life. And that's what that waiting was, my friend. A thunder held inside the chest. Each minute was a heartbeat too loud. Each breath, a reminder that the calm we lived in wasn't peace, it was a trap. The field was too still, too perfect. The wind had stopped. Even the insects had gone silent. We all knew what it meant. That silence wasn't mercy. It was the prelude to the storm. That was the calm before the thunder. A silence heavier than steel, sharper than bullets, and colder than fear itself. And even now, after all these years, when the night grows too quiet, I can still hear it. That heavy, waiting silence. Right before the earth began to roar. There came a moment when the waiting broke. It didn't begin with a shout, or with a gunshot. It began with a sound. At first, it was nothing more than a low murmur, like thunder rolling far beyond the horizon. A deep, rumbling growl that you didn't just hear, you felt in your chest. It crawled through the ground, climbed up your legs, and shook your bones. That's when I knew. The monsters were coming. The sound grew heavier, layer upon layer of engines growling in unison, like a storm made of steel. The earth started to tremble beneath our boots. The dirt shivered, the nails in the planks squealed, the canteens hanging from our belts clattered like wind chimes. Even the air vibrated, alive, charged, warning us that the roar was near. I glanced around. Some men stared at each other in silence, their faces pale and blank, eyes wide open like windows before a storm. Others gripped their rifles so tightly their knuckles turned white, as if a few pieces of steel could stop the avalanche that was on its way. Then Ivan, the boy with the medal, whispered to me, "They're here." Just 2 words. But they cut through the air like a blade. Then came the smell. That thick, oily scent, part gasoline, part burning metal, drifting in with the wind. It was the smell of engines, of death, of the war itself rolling toward us. And then, the roar. Not one. Not 10. Not 100. Thousands. Thousands of tanks advancing all at once. Engines growling. Tracks tearing the ground. Cannons groaning under their own weight. It wasn't just noise, it was a living thing. A beast made of steel and smoke with a single purpose, to crush everything in its path. The horizon began to rise in a wave of dust, thick and golden under the sun. The wind carried that bitter taste of dirt and fear. We still couldn't see them, but they were there. And my heart, pounding in my chest, whispered what we all knew. How can one man stop an ocean made of iron? Birds took off from the trees in black clouds. The sky, moments ago so calm, filled with beating wings, fleeing before the storm. It was as if even nature itself was trying to warn us. My friend, that roar still lives inside me. It wasn't just the sound of tanks. It was the sound of the world splitting in two, the moment when silence finally surrendered to war. And then, we saw them. At first, they were just dark smudges on the horizon, shadows drifting in the dust. But little by little they became shapes. Massive. Relentless. Advancing with the patience of death itself. Tanks. Dozens. Hundreds. Thousands of German tanks rising over the hills. Lined up like a wall of steel stretching from one end of the earth to the other. The ground trembled beneath every movement of those beasts. The July sun flashed off their cannons, and the clouds of dust they kicked up hung in the air like fog. It was as if the earth itself had turned into a single breathing monster. Down in the trenches we held our breath. Each man clutched his rifle, though we all knew those rifles were toothpicks against the iron giants that came for us. The gunners adjusted their sights, loaders worked with trembling hands slick with sweat. Officers shouted orders that vanished under the thunder of engines. And me, I just stared, feeling my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. Then the sky went dark. Smoke spread across the morning, and the first German shell screamed down. The ground erupted in bursts of fire. Columns of dust, debris, and men torn apart in seconds. The sound was unbearable. Motors roaring, explosions ripping the air, the shriek of steel colliding with steel. It wasn't just noise, it was chaos given a voice. And then, we answered. From the trees behind us, Soviet T-34s emerged. Green beasts streaked with mud, engines howling like thunder. They charged forward, fearless, straight into the storm. The ground shook like the sky itself had fallen. Our cannons roared, and for the first time that day, the thunder wasn't just theirs, it was ours too. The clash was brutal. Face to face. Machine against machine. Steel against steel. The first impact sent shockwaves through the earth. A German Tiger burst into flames, its turret thrown into the sky. A Soviet tank burned in return, glowing like a furnace as its crew tried desperately to escape. I'll never forget that moment. The instant I realized I was standing in the middle of the largest tank battle the world had ever seen. The air itself was fire. The earth was dust. And the roar, the roar was no longer from one side or the other. It had become one single monstrous voice. Born from the fury of thousands of machines and men colliding in hell. My friend, that morning had no sun. It had fire. It had smoke. It had steel twisting beneath our feet. And in that moment, the world stopped being sky and soil. It became an endless field of roaring thunder. My friend, then came the first blow. There was no time to think. No time to breathe. The world exploded in a roar so deep it went straight through my bones. A German shell fired so close that the air itself tore at my skin. The blast hit just a few meters away. The earth rose up in a storm of fire and stones that rained down on us like burning hail. The ground shook, my ears rang, and for a moment I thought I'd gone deaf. The tanks charged at each other like blind beasts. Engines screamed, metal slammed against metal. Cannons fired without pause. All of it blending into one monstrous, inhuman roar. Every explosion was a lightning strike splitting the sky. Every impact threw up clouds of dust and flame that swallowed the battlefield whole. The open fields of Kursk turned into a storm of steel. I saw a T-34 rush forward right in front of me. Its cannon fired, and a German panzer split in half, swallowed by fire. The roar was so powerful it felt like the earth itself cracked open. But the victory lasted only a heartbeat. A second shell struck the T-34. It burst into flames. I watched the crew inside pound desperately at the hatch. And then silence. A brutal, merciless silence as the fire devoured everything. The air was filled with fragments. Spinning blades of shrapnel, shattered branches, burning earth. Every step was a miracle. The man beside me fell without a sound, hit by something I never saw. Another, with his leg torn apart, looked straight into my eyes and whispered his son's name before collapsing. And still, no one stopped. The tanks kept moving, kept firing, kept ramming into one another. The thunder wasn't coming from the horizon anymore. It was beneath my feet, in my hands, inside my chest. The air burned. It smelled of gunpowder, of oil, of scorched flesh. Breathing was like swallowing fire. My friend, there was no sky, no earth anymore. Only explosions. Only smoke and flame. Only a never-ending roar wrapping around us. As if the entire world had decided to tear itself apart. That was the first impact. A single, eternal second in which I understood. We weren't just fighting inside the monster. We were inside it. And surviving that day would take nothing less than a miracle. If you could step inside my memory, my friend, the first thing you'd feel inside a tank is the heat. Not warmth, heat. Thick, suffocating, merciless. It clings to your skin, seeps into your lungs, and turns every breath into fire. There's no air in there, just the smell of oil, sweat, and burning metal. Inside, the noise is even worse. The engine's roar pounds against your bones. The shells thunder through your skull. And every impact against the armor feels like a god hammering at the gates of hell. The whole world becomes vibration, steel and sound shaking you from the inside out. We shouted at each other, but even then our voices vanished under the storm. I can still see my crew in that dim red glow from the control lights. Faces soaked in sweat. Eyes wide, burning with fear and focus all at once. The driver gripping the handles with white knuckles. The gunner squinting through the sights with forced calm. The loader, his arms trembling as he lifted shells heavy as stone. 4 men, locked inside a box of steel, trying to breathe between the roars and the explosions. Every shot we fired was hope. Every shell that hit us was a reminder that death was waiting just outside the armor. I remember one hit. A German shell slammed into our side. The whole tank lurched. The metal screamed. We froze, looking at each other in silence, waiting for the fire. But the armor held, that time. Do you know what it's like when seconds stretch into hours? In there, time stopped belonging to the world outside. Each breath was borrowed. Each heartbeat a gamble. The smoke mixed with the metallic sting of blood whenever one of us got hit. Sometimes a shard of steel sliced through a crack in the armor, cutting flesh like paper. And yet, no one stopped. You couldn't stop. Because if you didn't fire, they would. Inside that tank, there was no glory, no heroism. Just 4 men trapped in heat and noise, keeping each other alive 1 second at a time. That was our whole universe, dark, burning, trembling, made of iron and fear. I looked at those men and thought, these are my brothers now. 4 hearts beating inside a roaring beast of steel. 1 heartbeat shared among thousands of others out there. And somewhere between the deafening blasts and the shaking metal, I learned something. Machines don't win wars. Men do, the ones who bleed inside them. That was Kursk from the inside, my friend. Not glory. Not triumph. Just a furnace of steel, where ordinary men fought against the roar of death itself. If the roar was terrifying, what came next was worse. The whole battlefield was swallowed by fire and smoke, so thick that we no longer knew if it was day or night. Cannons thundered without pause. Each impact tore up the ground, hurling dirt and shrapnel into the air. And the sky rained burning embers that fell over us like sparks from a living hell. The morning's blue sky vanished behind a black shroud, so dense that not a single ray of sunlight could break through. What we saw wasn't light, it was fire flashing through the smoke, lightning that never stopped striking. The smell was unbearable. Burning fuel, boiling oil, charred flesh. Every breath was poison. The air scraped our throats raw, and every cough came out red. The burning tanks were rolling pyres. Some kept moving, flames crawling over their armor, until they finally exploded into fiery storms. I remember seeing a comrade jump from his tank, his body engulfed in fire, running a few desperate steps before collapsing in silence. That silence, it hurt more than any scream ever could. The ground itself was unrecognizable. Craters, twisted steel, fragments of men and machines. Every step forward meant stumbling over ash, over glowing metal still too hot to touch. Even the earth was burning beneath our boots. And the strangest thing, my friend, was that we could no longer see the enemy. The smoke covered everything. We fired into shadows, into the growl of engines moving through the haze. Sometimes it was a German tank. Sometimes it was one of our own. In that chaos, the fire made no distinction between friend or foe. The screams blended with the thunder of the guns. Short broken cries. Voices gasping for air that no longer existed. Some soldiers fell to their knees, eyes bloodshot, clawing at their throats for a single breath of clean air. And yet, we kept fighting. We fired through the blackness, through the smoke. Half blind, half dead, but still alive. Because in Kursk, my friend, there was no choice. You either roared with the fire, or the fire swallowed you whole. That day the battlefield stopped being a field. It became an ocean of fire and smoke. A place where the sky and the earth burned together. And even now, so many years later, I swear I can still taste the ashes in my lungs. When the roar finally began to fade for a few short hours, what lay before my eyes was a sight I will never forget. The earth was no longer earth. It had become a cemetery of iron. The same fields that once swayed with golden wheat were now an ocean of wrecked tanks, hundreds, thousands of them. Some still burning, others quietly smoking like dying beasts. The steel was twisted, melted, folded as if it had been paper. Torn tracks hung loose like broken ribs. Cannons pointed crookedly toward a sky that was no longer blue, but gray with smoke and ash. We walked among those ruins like ghosts. Each step took us past another shattered tank, split open with its crew still inside. Hands frozen on levers, helmets still on their heads. Their faces locked in the final second of their lives. They looked like statues, made of flesh, fire, and silence. The ground was cratered in black, littered with scraps of metal, torn uniforms, and the faint glint of shattered glass. The air reeked of cold smoke and raw iron, a smell that burned itself into my memory forever. I remember stopping in front of a Soviet tank, its side torn open like a wound. On the armor, scorched but still visible, someone had painted a message. For the motherland. Inside, nothing lived anymore. That phrase struck me harder than any explosion. Because behind every tank, every gun, there were men, boys really, with mothers waiting, with dreams half-written, with promises that would never be kept. A comrade bent down and picked something from the dirt, a half-burned photograph of a woman and two small children. He didn't say a word. He just slipped it into his pocket. As if by keeping it he could save them from disappearing completely. My friend, that field wasn't just wreckage. It was proof that war spares nothing, not even steel. Everything that once seemed invincible had been turned to ashes and silence. And standing among it all, we, the men, realized how fragile we truly were. That was Kursk after the roar. A field of twisted steel. An open grave. A reminder that war builds nothing. It only leaves scars that even time refuses to heal. If there's one thing I remember more vividly than the explosions, it's that they never stopped. It was an endless roar, a sound without beginning or end. A single unbroken storm of noise that devoured everything, the sky, the ground, even our own thoughts. The cannons thundered without pause. The echoes bounced across the open fields and came back again and again, until you couldn't tell whether it was a new shot or the ghost of the last one. The ground never stopped trembling. It was like living on top of an earthquake that refused to end. And our bodies shook with it, not just from fear, but because the very air seemed to vibrate inside our lungs. Hours passed, though none of us could count them anymore. There was no sunrise, no sunset. Only smoke that turned the sky to night, and fire that lit it again in flashes. Time stopped existing. All that remained was the roar. Inside the tanks, Men fired until their hands bled from loading shells. Outside, soldiers ran through craters, crawling across burning soil, throwing grenades, shouting, falling, rising again. Every action was repeated 1,000 times. Shoot, cover, advance, retreat, scream, fall. A choreography of madness with no rhythm, no rest, no mercy. At one point I froze. I didn't know where to run anymore. Around me there was nothing but smoke and sound, as if I had been swallowed whole by a giant. Trapped inside its chest, hearing its heart roar without end. And I thought to myself, when will it stop? Or will it ever stop at all? Some comrades shouted orders until their voices broke. Others moved their lips, but their words vanished, swallowed by the thunder all around us. We learned to read gestures, eyes, hands, because language itself had been destroyed by the noise. My friend, that endless roar was the battle. Not the tanks, not the bullets. It was the monster itself, an invisible beast made of sound and fear, that wrapped itself around us and refused to let go. Day and night, hour after hour, there was no silence, not even for a heartbeat. And just when you thought it was fading, another cannon fired, another tank exploded, another wave of thunder crashed through the field. It was like drowning in an ocean of noise, fighting to breathe, fighting to stay human. Every breath was an effort, every heartbeat a small victory. And though the battle ended long ago, that roar never truly stopped. It still lives inside me. It still trembles in my bones when the nights are too quiet. Because once you've lived inside the roar, silence is never the same again. There came a moment when I thought we had nothing left to give. We were drained, covered in dust, sweat, and blood. Our throats raw from smoke, our hands trembling from exhaustion. We hadn't slept in days. The roar never stopped, the earth never stopped shaking. And yet, somehow we stayed on our feet. Not because we were heroes, my friend, but because there was no other choice. It was either stand our ground, or be crushed beneath the monster of steel. In the middle of that chaos, I remember the faces of my comrades, more clearly than the tanks or the fire. Ivan, the boy with the medal from his mother, showed it to me before loading his rifle again. He whispered, "If I don't make it, give this back to her." I nodded, unable to speak. But inside, I swore I'd do the impossible to keep that promise. That small, trembling moment weighed more on me than all the tanks on that field. Then there was Sergei. He ran straight into a burning tank to drag 2 men out. The flames tore through his arms. But he didn't let go until they were safe. He lived, but his hands never healed. Even years later, his scars spoke louder than words. A story of pain, courage, and love written in flesh. And another soldier, I never even knew his name, pressed a folded letter into my hand. He shouted through the roar, "If I die, give this to my wife." I didn't even have time to answer. A second later, an explosion swallowed him whole. That letter stayed in my pocket for months. And when the war finally ended, I found her, and gave it to her with hands that still shook. I'll never forget her tears or how she whispered thank you, as if she were speaking to him through me. Kursk wasn't just steel and fire. It was humanity pushed to its limits. Men shaking with fear, yes, but still sharing their last sip of water. Still pulling a wounded friend to safety. Still fighting when their bodies begged to give up. Because in that battlefield of machines, it wasn't the tanks that truly endured. It was the men inside them. Men whose hearts refused to break, whose promises weighed more than fear itself. That's what Kursk really was, my friend. Not just the largest tank battle in history, but a story of ordinary men standing shoulder to shoulder, holding on when everything around them fell apart. And though many never came back, their memory still beats inside my chest. A living echo that whispers to me every time I close my eyes, "Don't forget us." After so many days when the whole world roared, there came a moment when the sound began to die. Not suddenly, not like a thunderclap, but slowly, like a wounded beast gasping for air. At first, I thought it was just my ears, deafened by the endless noise. But no, it wasn't me. The roar was truly fading. One cannon less, One engine stalling. One explosion that never came. The field of Kursk, once a storm of fire, began to sink into a heavy silence. Smoke still hung thick in the air, swallowing the sun. Flames still devoured the wreckage of steel and wood. But the noise, that monstrous noise that had followed us day and night, was finally dying out. And when it was gone, the silence was just as terrifying. I stepped out of my trench with trembling legs. What lay before me wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was an endless graveyard. Burned-out tanks. Bodies lying still. Guns rusting under the weight of blood and ash. The grass was gone, the earth blackened, the trees split like broken bones. A comrade beside me whispered, "Is it over?" His voice sounded strange, as if he'd forgotten how to speak without shouting. I didn't answer, because though the thunder had stopped, what remained was unbearable in its own way. My friend, the cruelest part was realizing that life didn't come back with the silence. We waited for the birds to return, for the wind to move the grass again, for human voices to rise over the wreckage. But nothing came. There was only emptiness, a vast, broken calm where even the living weren't sure if we were still men or only shadows. That day I learned something I've never forgotten. Silence can weigh more than the roar. Because the roar meant we were still fighting, still breathing, still alive. But the silence was the voice of death itself. And in Kursk, my friend, that voice echoed louder than anything I've ever heard. Now that my years weigh more than my rifle, now that my hands tremble more than the barrel of an old tank, I can tell you this: Kursk didn't end that summer. It didn't end with the last shot, or the final roar fading over the scorched earth. Kursk lived on, inside us, in our wounds, in our broken dreams, in the nights when we still wake up drenched in sweat, hearing that endless rumble echoing through our bones. The grass grew back over those fields. The wheat returned, the wind came again, and the birds began to sing. But beneath that calm, beneath that soil, still lie the twisted shells of tanks and the bones of thousands of men who gave their final breath in that inferno. Every blade of grass that waves there today hides a story never told, a name lost to the wind, a promise that could not be kept. Years later, I walked once more on that same ground. I saw children playing on what was once a field of steel. I saw old men resting in the shade of a new tree, never realizing that in that very spot, a tank had once burned with its crew trapped inside. And I thought, life is stronger than war. But memory must be stronger than forgetting. My friend, when I close my eyes, I still hear it. The engines roaring, the tracks biting into the earth, the cannons tearing through the sky. I still see Ivan clutching his medal, Sergei pulling his comrades from the flames. So many faces, so many hearts that refuse to surrender. They are not gone, not while I remember them. As long as someone speaks their names, they live on. Kursk was the largest tank battle in history, yes. But for me, it wasn't about numbers or records. It was about men. Every tank carried beating hearts inside, hopes burning brighter than the shells they fired, letters folded in dirty pockets, prayers whispered between explosions. Each blast wasn't just metal against metal. It was a son who never came home, a father lost forever, a friend swallowed by the smoke. Many call Kursk a triumph, a decisive victory. Maybe it was. But for those of us who were there, it wasn't glory. It was survival. It wasn't strategy. It was pain. It was humanity pushed to the very edge. A reminder of what we become when war devours everything human inside us. My friend, I tell you this because my voice still endures, even if it trembles. And I want it to be clear: what we lived through at Kursk must never happen again. History can call it a victory, but I remember it as a warning. Steel rusts, cannons fall silent. But the memory of the men trapped inside that roar, that never fades. And I promise you something. As long as my voice still lives, I'll keep telling you these stories. Because I don't want Kursk to be buried beneath numbers and maps. I want it to live in your heart for what it truly was. Not just the roar of thousands of tanks, but the roar of thousands of men clinging to life amid the fire. My friend, listen closely, and keep this in your heart. Kursk is not just history. It is memory. It is warning. It is wound. And as long as someone remembers, as long as someone speaks its name, the roar of Kursk will live on in the echo of time. Never forget. Never repeat. That is the legacy of that summer of steel. This was the story of Kursk, the roar of tanks that made the earth tremble in that fateful summer of 1943. Thousands of men were caught between steel and fire, and though the years have passed, their voices still echo through time. I saw it. I felt it in my bones. And even now, as my hands tremble with age, I refuse to let their sacrifice fade into silence. That's why I tell you this story, because as long as someone listens, they live on. Alive in our words, in our memory, in every breath of history that still carries their names. And I promise you, my friend, this won't be the last story. There will be more tales to tell, of battles and resistance, of men and women who gave everything on the field of duty. Because every story deserves to be remembered, not as a number in a book, but as a whisper of humanity that connects us to those who came before. My friend, as long as my voice still lives, I'll keep telling you these stories, so that we never forget, so that memory keeps roaring, like an eternal echo in the silence that follows war.